Second time, and I call the honourable member for Durack.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to rise to speak on this bill about an issue which is sadly very important within my large electorate of Durack and all communities throughout Australia. This bill amends a series of acts, including the Criminal Code Act 1995, Customs Act 1901 and the Surveillance Devices Act 2004. The bill contains a range of measures to improve Commonwealth criminal justice arrangements, including the following three: ban the importation of all substances that have a psychoactive effect that are not otherwise regulated or banned, ensure that Australian Customs and Border Protection officers have appropriate powers to stop these substances at the borders, and validate access by the Australian Federal Police to certain investigative powers in designated state airports. Deputy Speaker, whilst the bill comprises 6 schedules, today I just want to focus on Schedule 1, which will amend the Criminal Code Act and the Customs Act to strengthen the Commonwealth's ability to respond to new and emerging illicit drugs, known as new psychoactive substances. These so-called synthetic drugs are designed to mimic the effect of illicit drugs, but their chemical compositions are not captured by existing controls on these drugs. So effectively what we're talking about is the new ice. There is evidence that manufacturers design the chemical structures of new psychoactive substances to avoid current controls and prohibitions. The amendments in Schedule 1 will fill the regulatory gap. They will ensure that new psychoactive substances cannot be imported while the government assesses their harm and considers the appropriate controls to place on them. The measure takes a precautionary approach to dealing with psychoactive substances. It is intended to work in parallel with and not replace the existing arrangements which regulate the importation of both illicit drugs and substances with a legitimate use into Australia. Deputy Speaker, the largest urban centre in my electorate is Geraldton, with a population edging around 40,000 people, and with too many of its residents suffering from alcohol misuse, harm arising from illicit drug use, and the associated impacts including mental health, harm and crime. I'm advised by some working in the drug and alcohol services industry that the alcohol culture in Geraldton is indeed ridiculous, citing an anecdote of a bouncer recently seen sprawled on his back across the bar being fed alcohol through a hose. There are pockets of amphetamine use, such as speed or ice, together with a proportion of new psychoactive substances. These are causing serious issues because they simply cannot be tested at present. But let's talk about the notions of responsibility and acceptance. Personal harm associated with the use of drugs is considered to be high, and in comparison, violence-related crimes such as road accidents and domestic violence are more strongly linked to alcohol abuse. In general, there is an acceptance by those who are extreme drinkers and who are amphetamine users of their use and abuse and its impacts, and this acceptance of the use and abuse and its impacts plays a central role in these people's ongoing substance abuse. But there is an expectation that the police, drug and alcohol agencies will somehow fix the problem, rather than taking personal responsibility for their own actions and behaviours. Deputy Speaker, we know that 1 woman in a week in Australia dies from domestic violence. This is clearly not acceptable. I'd like to pause a moment to recognise White Ribbon Day, which is tomorrow, 25th of November. White Ribbon Day is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence against Women, and a day when we must stand against domestic violence. This is a community-wide issue in my electorate of Durack. Violence against women and children, and much of this harm is fuelled by drug and alcohol abuse.
Order. Call the honourable member for Durack in continuation.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I applaud the Australian and New Zealand Police Commissioners who this morning came together here at Parliament House to stand together against violence towards women and children. I was particularly pleased to see my West Australian Police Commissioner, Carl O'Callaghan, who joined with this group. This is a very powerful union, Deputy Speaker, which sends a strong message that our police leaders take claims of domestic violence seriously and puts perpetrators of domestic violence on notice. that Australia does not tolerate domestic violence towards women and children, and that you will be punished with the full severity of the law, to quote the Prime Minister from this morning's event, and the domestic violence victims will be protected. Deputy Speaker, in Geraldton, amphetamines and other synthetic drugs are prevalent amongst the general population, as well as the Aboriginal population. We all see this in our towns, cities, rural and remote communities, and also within our workplaces, families and friendship groups and neighbourhoods. I recently hosted a community crime forum in Geraldton where my co-host for the day, the Minister for Justice, the Honourable Michael Keenan, was urgently called back to Canberra as soon as he disembarked his flight in Geraldton. The forum held on the 18th of September went some way to further fleshing out the drug-related crime incidents and the causes and strategies in place to counter their use in Geraldton. During the forum, we sought the community's views on what practical and tangible actions might be taken to help address crime and antisocial behaviour, which frequently stems from drug and or alcohol abuse. I acknowledge the City of Greater Geraldton, the Geraldton Police and Commander Regional Western Australia Murray Smallpage for their support and participation in the forum and the excellent work they are doing in Geraldton and surrounds to help combat the supply of drugs into the region and to help combat antisocial behaviour, crime, violence and personal harm arising from drug and alcohol abuse. And it's worth recording some key sentiments that emerged from the crime forum, which were discussions amongst the 50-odd participants. Illicit drug use feeds crime, including burglary, house break-ins and muggings. The regrettable loss of funding for programs such as the Youth Bus and Midnight Basketball will have adverse impacts, and people are terribly concerned about this because they fear an increase in drug taking, antisocial behaviour and crime. Another observation, leadership within the Geraldton community, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, is strong, and joint endeavours to address drugs, crime and associated impacts of harm and violence are characterised by collaboration and planning amongst stakeholders, both government and not-for-profit groups. There is a strong sense that there is capacity in Geraldton to address the problem. However, a long-term view with bipartisan support and ongoing funding for programs are essential elements. Another observation, food, clothing, shelter, education and personal safety were considered causal factors for alcohol and drug abuse and resultant antisocial behaviour, harm and violence. Drug and alcohol misuse and abuse are symptoms of greater problems and not the cause of people's problems. Parental responsibility. Somehow we must get parents to exercise responsibility. Money for programs can only achieve so much and is not the complete answer. It's about changing our children's lives with their parents. It's not just about taking kids off the street, although I might say that that's a jolly good start. Deputy Speaker, the discussion at the Geraldton Community Crime Forum inevitably led to alcohol and illicit drugs as root causes of crime and antisocial behaviour, including domestic violence, underpinned by a range of social issues with which we're here all too familiar. A number of my constituents in Geraldton are passionate crusaders for drug reform, and in particular they campaign for a reduction in drug usage rather than a reduction in harm caused by illicit drugs, which they allege simply fuels the gateway of the ongoing criminality of illicit drug dealing, manufacture and usage. The bill that I'm speaking on here today will ensure that new psychoactive substances cannot be imported while the government assesses their harms and considers the appropriate controls to place on them, thereby limiting supply and usage. Deputy Speaker, I'm using the opportunity today to commend the work and the initiative being undertaken by the Midwest Gascoyne Human Services Regional Managers Group. This group comprises around 20 members of the heads of government agencies, that is regional managers and CEOs, across the Midwest and Gascoyne region of Western Australia, and is currently chaired by District Superintendent Andy Greatwood of the WA Police. This group has been in operation since 2006, which is more than 8 years, and they strive to coordinate resolutions and prioritise locational needs, act as a conduit between community and government departments, systems and processes, and facilitate and clarify funding possibilities to address local issues. The group recently developed a new strategic plan which aims to align itself with the Aboriginal Affairs Cabinet Standing Committee and various state subcommittees. They meet regularly in Geraldton and Carnarvon and have a system of community-based subcommittees who collaborate on program delivery, with a good deal of their time is dedicated to the harms of alcohol and drug misuse. Deputy Speaker, synthetic psychoactive substances pose a serious risk to the community, just like traditional illicit drugs. Associated harm and tragic deaths arising from the use of these substances have been well reported. The legislation will ban all psychoactive substances unless they have a legitimate use, and will close the loophole that allows people to avoid prosecution by ever so slightly changing the chemical structure of a drug. I commend this bill, which amends a series of acts and contains a range of measures to improve Commonwealth criminal justice arrangements that will ban the importation of substances that have a psychoactive effect that are not otherwise regulated, and ensure that Australian Customs and Border Protection officers have appropriate powers to stop these substances at the border. I commend this bill to the House.